Hello everyone and welcome to today's Public Relations Institute of Australia members only webinar. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be with us. Today's webinar is on communicating in a crisis, a topic that there is a huge amount of interest on throughout the industry. Our speakers today, the founders of Scout, Renee Berteau and Saul Flores, will talk about best practice readiness and what a complete end-to-end communication and digital approach to crisis and issues management could look like for your organisation. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type them directly into the comments box. We'll also allow some time at the end for questions. Renee and Saul have also kindly agreed that a recording of this webinar can be made available to webinars after we're done today. To members, sorry. We're so pleased to have both Renee and Saul with us today to share their expertise. So welcome Renee and Saul.
Thanks, Jonathan, and welcome everyone. Thank you for making the time to listen to us today, and hopefully we'll hear lots of questions from you after we've made our short presentation, which will be around 30 or 40 minutes. As Jonathan mentioned, Scout has been purpose-built to develop an integrated strategic comms and digital approach to issues and crisis management. We'll just change these. It's great that to see we've got people listening in today that are from a variety of industries. You'll each have different stakeholders and potential issues. However, we know that all issues and crisis evolves differently, but most have very similar steps for preparedness and managing your company and your reputation through that crisis. So Sol and I, over the next little while, will talk to a few specific points that we think are really important for you to understand in terms of preparing for a crisis. And they are talking about the dynamics of risks, reputation, and digital communication channels. Then we'll turn to talking about reputation management and the importance of what you do now to support your organisation before a crisis. Then we'll talk about the need to elevate the customer expectations in crisis management planning. And last, we'll turn to the digital media, the scale and impact of digital media, and what you should have in place to ensure a consistent approach through your digital ecosystem. The most significant change in our operating environment as communications professionals is the dramatic increase in the speed at which crisis spreads. You can see from this graph here that over a quarter of the crisis spread to international media within an hour and over 2/3 within 24 hours. Now contrast that with it taking about an average of 21 hours for companies to respond, which leaves them open to online conversations really spreading like wildfire. Now what's driving this change? We've seen demise of print, we've seen a shift to digital first as a change way for the newsrooms work and the way that journalists behave. We've seen fewer journalists doing more and the never-ending need for content. We also have seen a really strong impact of social media to promote news and to instigate stories. Today we're going to be talking a lot about risks and issues, so I thought it would be worth a moment just touching on these different areas and how we're talking to them today. We're talking to risks in terms of events which may or may not occur, such as a fire, a crash, an accident, fraud, a product recall. These are generally quite static in nature. We're also then talking about issues. Now issues are trends, ties of opinion which will affect the organisation. For example, environmental legislation, public policy, and these do change continuously. It's important when assessing our preparedness that we note that crises always emerge from a risk event, but they may arise from an overlooked issue. So we'll talk today about crisis and the way they're managed successfully and how that is so important that we deal with them preparedness before that happens. There are many sources of potential crisis in every organisation, and even the best prepared can be hit by a disaster from a totally unexpected quarter. If we now look at this graph, it's a little small to see, but it gives you a sense of the World Economic Forum. Each year they produce a global risks report, and this takes the view of CEOs internationally and what they are seeing as the most likely and highest impact reports of risks. If you look on the X and Y axis, you'll see impact and likelihood. We'd really suggest that you take the time for your organisation to map out what you think are your risks. It's a great opportunity to get your team together and really think about what risks you currently have identified as impact and likelihood and where they sit on a graph similar to this one. It can help you to get a more dynamic response going for a change in the environment in which you're working, or a change in your business which has brought new stakeholders or different types of stakeholders forward in your risk assessment. Then we look at sort of prioritising risks and issues, and again this can be the second step of what you've done when you look at that graph, is now to map them in terms of prioritising those risks and issues. So again, you can see there's the probability on one axis and the impact, which mirrors the graph before, and you can start to put into this grid where you think risks would sit for your organisation, and it can help you to prioritise what you actively manage and what is the highest potential damage to the organisation's reputation. So I'm just going to summarise this section by really turning to look at and have you think about your current plan, the assumptions that you've made, and how these may have changed over time. It may be that you only did your crisis and issues management plan, 18 months ago, but in that time a lot can happen, a lot has happened in your operating environment and may well have changed in your business. So let's look at response. Response, we used to be able to have 24 hours to prepare a response for the media, and now, as we saw in that earlier graph, they spread internationally within an hour. The channels in which we communicate, we were able to prepare messages and our management team for traditional communications media. Now we have social media, cloud-based customer service, many more channels in which we need to reach our stakeholders and be available to listen to them and respond. Customer focus. The focus on a crisis, was often very focused on protecting the business, and escalation and the way that a company looked at their crisis and issues was very much through the lens of how we're going to protect our business. Now, with many more organisational goals being client-centric or customer-centric, talking about putting the customer first, we really need to assess, does our crisis management plan align to this? Are we putting our customers' expectations in the middle of our crisis management plan, or is it something that we do quite outside of the normal communication channels, and therefore won't have that sense of authenticity with everything else we're doing in terms of communication with our customer and key stakeholders. The impact, we have had public exposure to crisis used to have an expiry time. The dust used to settle, the news reports would go away, but now with the real-time public forums, the ability for news to be retrieved quickly and to stay available for a very long time, there is a flow-on effect that takes many months and years for us to manage through. Now, as we talk to reputation management, which is an incredibly important part of the way that we manage a crisis and issue, is looking at the changing way in which reputation has become a important part of the valuation of a company. If you look at this graph here, this particular survey estimates that intangible assets account for 78% of the value of Fortune 500 companies, and that means reputation is playing a very big role, and it looks to be only increasing. So what's driving the reputation? When we look at another survey which AMR, one of our sister companies, produces, they look at research from over 1,000 participants and say to people, what is it that you ask and what you look for in a company? What's most important factors when you think about the reputation of an organisation? And you can see there that authenticity is the key driver of reputation. And it's worth us taking a moment to really think about, are we still talking with an authentic voice? Are we still acting in an authentic way as we move our organisations through a crisis or an issue? The key factor for us in a company's ability to be able to do that is preparedness. It's very difficult when you're in the middle of a crisis to be able to move from a rational voice to really continuing to speak with a consistent and authentic voice with your key stakeholders. And reputation, having a stellar reputation means that you will have trust in a crisis, and it's really important that this building of reputation can be done now to provide a much more supportive stakeholder environment in which your message will land in times of a crisis. If you look there, that as we have the reputation score become stronger, the net promoter score is positive, and trust in a crisis is dramatically improved from organisations that have an existing poor reputation score. So we've talked about the qualitative measures of reputation and how that impacts an organisation. We'll just take a moment to look at the financial impact of a crisis on your reputation. You've probably all heard this famous quote from Warren Buffett, and if you will look at the crisis will in fact obviously have a damaging effect on your reputation, but how you handle the crisis in an organisation makes an enormous difference to where you land after the crisis has hit, and how long your organisation will have the after effects of that crisis. If you communicate effectively with your stakeholders, they will forgive you and probably even have more respect for you as an organisation if you've been able to authentically and effectively communicate with them as that time goes on. We look here at the stock prices, again reflecting the financial value and impact of reputation. Stock prices usually take a hit when there's a crisis, but how long the negative fallout lasts depends on good communications. We put people, organisations, into two buckets here: the recoverers, and that are companies that respond well. We found that their share prices recover in around 2 months and even can gain momentum because they've had the trust of their stakeholders. On the other hand, we have the non-recoverer group, which are companies that responded badly and the shares have continued to fall. We look at this piece of research from Oxford Metrica, and they did a review of 15 recent high-profile organisational crises and found that within a year there was more than a 20% difference in the shareholder value between effective responders and ineffective ones. A couple of companies that I'm sure you're all aware of, Toyota and Volkswagen, and the recent issues that they've had. This sort of helps to illustrate the point in the way that companies may face a similar type of crisis in terms of the quality of their vehicle and the safety defects, and the way that they respond has been very different, and then the outcome of that in terms of the valuation on the company and the ongoing reputation effect has been very much mirrored by the response they've had. Toyota in this instance their share price dropped 20% of the aftermath of this issue, but within 6 months it had recovered most of that loss. Volkswagen, by comparison, dropped a similar amount in the days following, and 6 months later it was still falling, and it's down to about 60% now of its initial share price before they encountered the issues with their cars. We'll also just now turn to customer and stakeholder engagement. As I flagged earlier, we have seen a change in the way organisational goals are focused, and that there's very much looking now to the customer being centric to our communications through organisations. But the traditional focus on preparedness for a crisis is very much looked at how. How do we escalate this crisis? How do we assess the incident? And really thinking about how that impacts the business, and looking then at how we protect the business rather than integrating the response with the organisation goals and values. Preparedness really needs to be alive to your current and changing customer expectations. And when we look to the next slide, we're really asking you to think through, does your crisis and management plan reflect your organisational goals and your customer promise? Have you really thought through the why and the when? Does your crisis and issues management plan start with your organisational goal, and make sure that that is aligned to the way you're going to approach your communication with key stakeholders throughout the crisis or an issue? And then when? Again, the escalation time frame is often determined by when there starts to be impact to the organisation or to the business. It might be things like, when is it going to affect so much of our business continuity, rather than thinking about when does the customer care, or when does our key stakeholder care, when do they want to know, what's their expectations, and do we have the right systems in place to be able to actually know what those expectations are and to actively listen to them. So we need to evolve our preparedness approach that integrates the need to protect the business with what our customer needs. The end goal is to create an approach that is dynamic, interactive, and brand aligned, which is probably a really good time for Sol to start speaking about the digital media scale.
So in the intro, I think when Renee was talking about why crisis management and issues management is different now than it would have been a few years ago, obviously the role of digital media is constantly evolving and taking on a bigger share of voice and driving how these stories get told. I think everyone's sort of aware of these sorts of stats at a high level, but these are always really fascinating to me to look at. I think about 52,000 Facebook likes per second, every second on the internet. And to visualize that, imagine filling ANZ Stadium with people who constantly press like on Facebook for the rest of their lives. That's the kind of pace that the internet's constantly moving at, and perhaps as a society we'd be better off if we all did just put everyone into the stadium and press like and just ignore Facebook. But this kind of volume and this kind of speed is what kind of puts the organization at risk, because if the tide turns and if this kind of machine gets going around your story, you very quickly lost control. I think the challenge, though, is we're all sort of aware of these sorts of stats at a high level, and we're kind of conscious that this is happening, but it can be difficult to understand how this relates to our organization. So this is a data mapping exercise we did for WPP. So WPP is a holding company which essentially owns Scout. WPP is somewhat well known, I think, within the media, marketing, communications industry. It's one of the largest networks in the world. But outside of that, it's probably not a common household name. I think the average business person or the average consumer probably don't really know that much about it, and they're not that aware of it. And when we look at WPP, we also see a fairly condensed organization. There's only a handful dozen people who actually directly work for WPP. Everyone else works for the agencies that are part of the holding company. And that sort of structure is probably quite similar to a lot of government organizations and schools and universities, where you have a certain sort of administrative entity, but really where your brand comes to life is as a network of many different organizations which you have varying levels of control and influence over. So when we looked at WPP, at face value, it's not that exposed to social media. However, when you consider that it controls 99 different brands and agencies, and these circles are drawn to scale, so you'll see the size of this red circle representing the difference between one organization of WPP and then the 99 agencies they control. Those agencies command a collective 280 social media accounts. So even just at this scale now, WPP is starting to look a little bit smaller than the overall network they're a part of. Those social media accounts put out, on average, 300 posts per month. And those 300 posts per month are going to 900,000 followers. And I think what's interesting about this visualization is it becomes clear that WPP, from a consumer point of view or a brand point of view, can be impacted by any one of those posts from any one of those accounts going out to any one of those 900,000 followers, but their ability to control and listen to that message is actually quite small. And that's what's really challenging about social media in a crisis, is that your team on the ground only have a certain number of hands and eyeballs to actually get the job done, but the reach and the impression that your brand or your organization is connected to is quite vast, and is probably vaster than you might give it credit for at face value. How do you start to manage this? Number one is you have to have a sense of what this exposure looks like. You have to really think about not just your direct followers, but who are their followers and who are their followers' followers. How does the kind of actual network across social media connect back to your brand? Once you've got a sense of that, having a real idea of who the influencers are within that network matters a lot. So there are 900,000 followers for WPP in this example, but a lot of those are actually following very specific accounts and individuals within the network. So Sir Martin Sorrell, who owns the network, is a really influential person. So if there's a specific issue, a lot of people are going to be looking to his personal Twitter and LinkedIn for guidance. Knowing those people and having a plan in place to get a message to them, to listen to what's happening in their kind of secondary network, can be really important. The next thing to think about for digital in a crisis is what role technology can or should play in helping you manage it. This is obviously a very simple but quite powerful system that we're very familiar with. You have a big red lever that you pull that lever, lights go on, sirens go on, the sprinklers turn on, it's connected to the fireys, so you're going to have a truckload of the bravest and most well-trained women and men coming to save the day. And that's really what you want. One point of control, a loud message, and a network that's going to bring in all the help that you need. The reality, though, of technology in terms of communications and digital is not so simple. This is intentionally sort of an overwhelming infographic. Every logo on this page represents a different technology platform that is currently in market that organizations are using to either listen and get insights, to create content, to manage messages, or control channels. And what's fascinating to me about this chart, it's constantly being updated, and every single time there's a new one, the logos get smaller and smaller, meaning the landscape of technology and communications is constantly getting more complicated and more siloed. And there's sort of two ways to look at this. One is the positive. It means that there's more tools we have that help us listen, interpret, to target content and messages to specific channels, and to be more controlled and organized, either during our kind of business as usual or during a crisis. The flip side of that is that this is a very, very hard piece to understand. In a lot of organizations that we work with, you might have someone in the technology department that understands what tools you're using, how they're connected, what their capabilities are, what kinds of things have been automated. But if they're not part of your crisis response team, and if your crisis response team doesn't understand that stuff to begin with, it's going to be a little too late to start playing catch up. And there's some really practical ways in which this can hurt you. I think a lot of organizations have automated emails that go out. In a really simple example, if you buy something, often you'll get a thank you email as a receipt. A lot of organizations will have newsletters or offers or promotions that are kind of automatically triggered, either based on a schedule or based on some sort of behavior. How bad would it be if there's a flood and people have lost their lives or their property, and the first thing that people in that community hear from you is something promotional via an email that was clearly written by a computer script or a robot, or without a lot of thought about the context? Those sorts of automated communications are happening all the time. If you don't really understand how this picture and this tech framework applies to your organization, it's going to be hard to kind of stop those things and regain control. To bring back to the fire example, if you don't have an understanding of this tech footprint within your organization, how that relates to what you want to do in a crisis, rather than that really neat and clean lever to pull, it's going to look like this. You've got hundreds of different things you need to pick up and use to respond to a crisis. And this is really, I think, what we really advocate for a lot as Scout. For us, it's all about preparation. So, as much risk mitigation as you can do, there's always going to be some eventuality that something will happen in your organization. And what typically happens in the red line is that the issue escalates very, very quickly. The damage to your brand becomes very, very strong. And then there's this long tail of consequences that all result from how well you managed it during those first 24 hours. And our view is that the more preparation you put into it, the more you can shrink that line. You can reduce not only the peak of the damage, but you can also reduce the impact over the long tail. And the goal, of course, is to get back to business as usual. I think, what we find, very simply is a lot of organizations just simply don't put a lot of preparation into it. I think there's a view that, well, we're all very experienced and we know how this organization works and we're ready for anything, or that who knows what could happen, so why bother putting some preparation into it because anything could happen, so how can we plan for that? What we find is there's actually a fairly somewhat standard list of activities, of assets, of processes that you want to be putting in place and refreshing in your organization to help you achieve that shift from the really steep red line to the less steep blue line. More or less what you want to be doing is a capability to monitor, to listen, what's happening around your organization, what's happening with your customers, what's happening in their communities, both online and offline. You want to be prepared, so there's a number of ways to prepare. You can have escalation pathways designed in your organization. You can do practice runs. We run simulation exercises where we bring people into a room for a day, give them a scenario to respond to, and then coach them through that process. You can build assets. You can build versions of your website that are more tailored to certain types of issues. You can prepare emails. We always recommend you can prepare those things to help you think through the eventuality and then refresh them when the actual situation happens. But it's a lot easier to start with something to edit rather than a blank sheet of paper when the pressure's on. Thinking about how you're going to respond, identifying which stakeholders you need to talk to, what their different needs are, how the different channels that you have at your disposal are going to play out, all can be done ahead of time. You can do that sort of mapping and thought process well in advance. And then thinking about how you need to change what you're doing to promote your organization or your brand after the crisis is over, and having a really strong connection between what happened in the crisis and what we want to change about our ongoing business as usual. And so this is it's a table, but essentially it's a checklist. And you can think about this as, do we have this element in our organization today? Do we have this capability? Do we have this asset? Do we understand these terms? Is this well socialized? So is this something that just the PR team is across, or is something that the technology team understands and the operations team and people at the front lines of your business? Are they across how this picture comes together? I think, it's that old saying that, stitch in time saves 9. You put a little bit into the effort of preparation, and you're basically buying insurance policy for your organization to come through a crisis a little bit more safely. The way that we look at that is there's kind of three kind of activities. The first step is really to do an audit. Start by thinking about what kind of risks the organization might be exposed to. And some of the frameworks that Renee presents at the beginning can be really helpful. Look at what's happening around the world. Look at those categories the World Economic Forum has, and then think about that in your own business's context. And oftentimes you can do that, in a couple hours with the right stakeholders in the room and some good facilitation. Get some really interesting things coming out of that. What we often see is that organizations are really prepared for crises and issues that actually aren't going to have that much impact on their reputation. I think every organization has, a fire drill plan. So if there's a fire in the building, we know where the exits are. And that's really important for safety, but for reputation point of view, no one's really going to blame you necessarily for your brand, your kind of reputation if there's a fire and you handle that well. But things like those intrinsic issues, we haven't managed our business, we haven't managed customer data, we haven't managed the trust that customers have put in us. Those can be really interesting. So when we look at that audit of risks, we want to think about where you're currently prepared, but what should you be prepared for, and where's that gap? We also start to look at kind of processes and assets you have in place, the kind of training and technology, either that you already have or that you could have. We facilitate that as a process, but we think we really just advocate that that's an activity that should be happening a lot more throughout organizations. Next is to think about preparation. So you've got this audit, that's basically a gap analysis. What are we not doing? You got to start to fill in some of those blanks. Again, that can be challenging if you don't have a really solid business case, if there's a lot of funding required. I think that's where we try to talk to boards and to governing organizations about this concept of an insurance policy and some of those statistics around how much better your reputation in business can recover with a bit of preparation. And then finally, it's important really to consider this as an ongoing process. What we find a lot is organizations have some sort of crisis plan, but it's out of date. It's sitting in a drawer somewhere, and it has a date stamp on it. This was written in 2004 by somebody who doesn't even work here anymore, and we don't know who that person is, and we haven't really refreshed that. The more that you can find time to come back and revisit the risks, revisit what you need, do more practice, recreate those assets and those scenarios before a situation happens, that's what's going to keep you really sharp and really fresh. So we're very strong advocates of the fact that, you can't just do this once and leave it alone. You have to constantly be revisiting it and making it sharper. And in a sense, that's essentially what Scout offers. We facilitate these services where we act as consultants to run these audits. We have a very solid team of developers, engineers, and designers who can create a lot of these assets in the preparation phase. And we also offer standby retained services as part of that ongoing team. So if you want the fire brigade who can come in and save the day for you, we can do that as well. But beyond that, I think we're just advocates for more of this happening in the industry, more people taking an integrated approach between traditional crisis and comms planning and digital crisis and comms planning. We'd love to live in a world where more organizations were better prepared with a more complete preparation.
Okay, so that wraps up the talk that Sol and I wanted to have with you, but we're really interested in hearing any or responding to any questions that you may have about your organisation and the risks and challenges that you're facing.
Just while we're waiting for questions to come through, I had one. So when you're talking about, every business sort of has a fire exit sort of plan, how do you convince clients that having a crisis management plan is almost that important?
I think something that can help is finding examples of similar issues that have happened to similar organizations. So, if we're looking at, a government organization in Australia, we can look at government organizations that serve a similar role around the world. We can look at case studies of how they've handled it either well or poorly. There's also some nice, interesting research that's come out of University of Cambridge, which I think Renee showed one of the graphs on, that just shows in a share price context, if that's relevant, how much faster that comes back online when you have an identifiable preparation approach for crisis management. I think that those simulation exercises can also be a really engaging way to get senior leadership across this concept. I think as communication professionals and people who have been through some of these situations before, they can feel really quite close to home. But for people who are not that focused on communications, not that focused on risk, and are much more focused on the future and building the business and kind of more positive elements, putting them in a room to run a situation and say, all right, we all think we're prepared. Let's see how we go with this sort of situation. Part of how we run those is we have people who are former journalists on staff who will sit outside that room. They'll start to call your mobile phone at play acting as a journalist and ask you really tough questions. And that's, I think, when a lot of the wheels start to turn for senior leadership to say, yeah, there's actually a little bit more to this than I thought. And some of these risks that these people are bringing up, I can see happening in the industry. And I have colleagues at similar organizations who've dealt with this, and they start to feel that real life kind of feeling of not being as prepared as they'd like to. So that's a few different ways that we look at it: case studies, research, and actually putting people on the hot seat.
Okay. And Renee and Saul were both kind enough to be part of our Communicating When Tragedy Strikes masterclass, which took place earlier in the year. And one of the things you did as part of that workshop for us was run a crisis simulation scenario with our attendees. So is what we saw they're typical of what those sort of those would look like with a client, or what kind of scenario planning do you do there?
I think when we run the masterclass was kind of the supersized version. So I think we had quite a few people there.
We had 70
people.
Yeah.
Those can be really interesting because then you get sort of the power of collective intelligence and lots of people asking interesting questions. We also run them in a smaller context, kind of the size of a board or a leadership team. So that's kind of more 8 to 12 people. And those can be good too, because that means everyone has to kind of be the person on the hot seat. We actually see those as being kind of both really effective for different reasons. I think when you're working with a small team, it's great because it really kind of personalizes the experience and makes everyone think about what would I do, how would I do this, and how do I need to be more prepared. But when you do it in a group sense, it helps people think about the big picture. And so if you have a large organization where you have a kind of core who's really focused on risk, but a larger set of people who aren't, it can be a really engaging way to kind of break down some silos and get a lot of people thinking about this topic.
People that wouldn't normally sort of...
That's right. And I think to Sol's point that engagement is a really important part of this process. So when we did the workshop at the PRIA event, we tried to get the engagement of people throughout that workshop, and we do that very much with the smaller groups in the workshops we do for an organisation. So we do a lot of preparation work going into it. We engage with the people who are going to be involved in the workshop beforehand to be able to get from them sense of their current knowledge and their current level of engagement with the crisis plan, so that we can tailor that situation to them. And then we do use, as Sol said, a lot of stimulants through the workshop. We'll have tweets going out. We'll be able to replicate what the social media landscape is going to look like throughout that crisis. We will have journalists on the phone. We'll do a lot of things that get everybody engaged through that workshop, because that's one of the things that's a big challenge to communications professionals, is to get everybody experiencing the crisis at the same time in the same kind of way, so that often the comms professional is the one that's been in them before and the only one that's seeing the real drive and necessity to get these things done. But if we can get all the leadership team on the same page by having that shared experience, it makes the rest of the planning and the resources that you need to commit to this type of plan a lot easier for the comms professional to be able to complete.
Great. We've got Desmond here who's asked, how effective is allowing brand advocates to respond to crisis on social media? Would you allow this, or would you prefer for the crisis team to respond?
Well, it sort of depends. I think with brand advocates, if they're not your staff, if these are kind of influencers who you may have partnered with, or just community members who are really passionate about your organization, your mission, obviously, they own their own voice, and so, it's kind of up to them to determine what they want to post or what they want to write about. And I think what Renee talked about earlier around authenticity is really key here. If people feel that you've incentivized someone to speak on your behalf or deliver kind of a message that you've given them, that can very quickly deteriorate that sense of authenticity that people want to hear. On the flip side, if you've got advocates who are aligned with your mission and who are aligned with what your message needs to be during the crisis, it never hurts to help them be informed, to help give them, within, depending on the nature of the crisis, what's legally appropriate to share, and let them make their own decision and their own kind of voice around how they want to explain that. That can play the authenticity driver in a different direction, because if someone can see that this is someone who doesn't work for your organization, but who is, going to bat for you and has had some interesting insights about the issue, that can really help, and sometimes that can be more powerful than a press release that's coming from your own team. So I think there's not a black or white answer to that. It depends on their relationship to you, the nature of the crisis, what you can share. If there's ongoing investigation, if there's been loss of life, it starts to look quite different in terms of what you might want to do with brand advocates.
That's right, and I agree, Sol, that's a great response. I think that the other thing to keep in mind, and what Sol and I have been talking about too, is the level of preparedness that you can take, so that those types of voices are not the main voice in this instance, because you will already have a really good handle on the channels through which your key stakeholders would like to be communicated to. You're listening to what's coming back from your different stakeholder groups. So your voice will be the most informed. It will be the one that is reaching the key stakeholders in the quickest and most effective way. The brand advocates and other voices that could be helpful through a crisis, that's great that they're there, and we try and support those, but what we're trying to get to is that the voice of the organisation and the channels in which they're communicating are the most powerful ones, and the ones that are shaping the communication around the crisis.
Great. All right. Well, if there's not any more questions, I think we might be done. I know we're running a little bit early today, but everyone can sort of head off to lunch after they're done listening to this. So thank you very much to both of you for being a part of today. It was excellent to have you with us. And I'd just like to let everyone that's still on the line as well know that on the 26th of April, we're going to be running a webinar on why a government relations program should form part of every organisation's communications arsenal. And that's going to be run by Benjamin Haslam, who's the co-CEO of Wells Haslam. So it'd be great to have you all back on the line for that one. But for now, I'll just remind you that we will be sending around a link to the recording of this webinar, and that'll also be available in the member resources section on our website. And we hope to see you all again at another webinar event very soon. Thanks very much, Renee and Saul.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan.